Hey folks, Nick here from Another BookTube channel, and today I'm going to be talking about Epitaphs from the Abyss #1, the new release from Oni Press, which is being marketed as the revival of EC comics in the modern day. I was very much looking forward to this comic because I love EC comics. I love them. They're so much fun. They're great. The art of that time period by those masterful artists is just—it's so timeless and beautiful and terrifying and just so much fun reading those old comics. So I thought, okay, cool, a revival of EC comics sounds like a great idea. How are they going to differentiate it from just any other horror anthology? Because horror anthologies never went away. You know, we still have those. There's a Creepshow one based on the the original Creepshow movie that's going on now, which is pretty good. I read a couple issues of it, and it's fun. So I was like, okay, so if they're going to be doing this in the EC style, that'll really set it apart because EC had such a distinct style. Like, there's a reason that EC was the best of those pre-code horror publishers. Like, everybody was trying to keep up with EC Comics, and trying to, you know, replicate what they were doing. So it'll be really cool to see that in the modern day, like kind of going back to that original style. I was incredibly disappointed by this comic. It's not terrible, but my opinion of it is just really soured because of what a completely missed opportunity it is, and it's just being completely mismarketed. It's not an EC comic. This is not what an EC comic was like or should be like by no definition of it. So what I want to talk about in this video is why Epitaphs from the Abyss fails as an EC Comics revival, and then also do a review of just the stories in general. So the first thing I want to talk about, I broke this up into 4 sections. The first section is a misuse, or rather a lack of use, of a horror host. Epitaphs from the Abyss begins strongly. On the first page, we get introduced to the new host of this EC title, the Gravedigger. One of the most iconic parts of EC Comics was their hosts, like the Crypt Keeper, the Vault Keeper, the Old Witch. These are characters that throughout the anthology series were recognizable constants. So, okay, cool. We've introduced a new person, a new creature host into that category, and it's a good design, and it makes sense. Gravedigger, awesome. That fits right at home with a Crypt Keeper and an Old Witch. Like, that's great. And then the Gravedigger goes away, like almost pretty much completely. So like I kind of alluded to, the EC horror hosts, what they would do is at the beginning of pretty much every EC story, I think it's every one, there'd be a little introductory paragraph with the head of the host, at least their head, where they're saying an introduction to the story. They're giving us a little intro that has tailored puns that relate to the story, that just kind of lead us in. And then at the end of the story, the final panel will also usually be that host giving us a little summation, a little wrap-up, more puns, and then a lead-on into the next story. And once in a while, not every time, the hosts might even pop up within a story just as a little bridge between scenes. I guess maybe if they just needed to kind of fill in a panel. So the host was a prevalent, consistent voice in old EC comics. The Gravedigger disappears from this comic after that first page, comes back only once in any noticeable way, and it was for the last story. By the time I got to that story, I forgot that the Gravedigger even existed. And that's disappointing. That's such a bummer. Because, like, oh, you've introduced something kind of neat. Like, you started the right thing, and then you didn't proceed with it. Now there are narration boxes throughout some of the stories that are in a green font. that don't belong to anybody else, that's probably the Gravedigger's voice. But also the introductory text dialogue from him isn't green, so it doesn't connect the two. So it's easy. So maybe it's not him. Maybe it's not the Gravedigger. Maybe it's just a general narrator. Uh, so if it is the Gravedigger, you didn't make that connection. Put his little face in a box somewhere. Like, put him in there. Like, make him a real host. Make him part of the experience. That's what EC Comics is about. That's just part of it. So they didn't use the host correctly. Big disappointment. The second issue I had with Epitaphs from the Abyss is the structure of the stories. There is a specific, simple formula that Bill Gaines and Al Feldstein perfected that when they were writing the horror stories, in particular for EC Comics. They got a ton of mileage out of this formula, despite the fact that it is pretty repetitive. And that formula is quickly establish who is the evil person, like who's the bad guy, who are they taking advantage of, have that bad guy cross a certain line, and then in the end be given an ironic, punchy comeuppance. Every EC horror story pretty much follows that formula, but they were able to do so much with it because just they would come up with different scenarios, and more than anything, they would lean into the strengths of their incredible artists. So if they knew, like, okay, Graham Engels is going to be drawing this one, so we're gonna have like an old haggard person in this because he's really good at drawing old haggard faces. Like they knew who their artists were. They knew what stories to write to fit them. In Epitaphs of the Abyss, or from the Abyss, they do keep the ironic, shocking endings with varied success, and honestly, that's even being generous. But the stories themselves just don't have that formula where we don't have the quickly identified, like, who's the bad guy, who's going to get the justice in the end. They try to just kind of be random modern horror stories, and that's fine if you're not marketing a book to be an EC comic. Like that this is not what EC comic stories feel like. It's not what they read like. There's no moodiness or subtlety to the writing, which is what kind of defined EC as well. I'll get a little bit more into the lack of subtlety in the last section that I talk about. All right, so the third section I want to talk about is the art and the layouts. So comic art has changed a lot in 70 years. Now, the old EC comics were stuck in a pretty rigid panel structure for the most part because of the way that they were produced. The way that it would work is the writer would go in and they would kind of create the panels themselves and put in the narration boxes and kind of force the artist to then take the page and then work within the parameters that they've already set. So wasn't really an opportunity for like a splash page or something particularly creative in terms of panel composition or panel layout rather. And so it forced those artists to get really great at using the space efficiently to create mood, to create atmosphere, to introduce characters, to like get all those things across in a relatively small amount of space. Epitaphs is laid out like a modern comic. So there's a lot of open panels. There's a lot of irregularly shaped panels. Like it gets to play with the page a bit more. And again, this is a good thing for a modern, any type of comic that isn't an EC comic. But again, you're calling yourself an EC comic, but you're not giving me anything to look at that reminds me of EC comics. This just looks like Creepshow, like just anything else on the stands. This doesn't separate itself visually in any way. And what's really annoying is they could have done something very simple to make that connection. If they didn't want to mess with the art style or the layouts or anything like that, they could. All they had to do was change the coloring, make the colors be the Marie Severin 4-color process. Just have it reflect what those comics used to look like color-wise. Because even that's a simple connection to just tie it back to the classic, but update it to be a little bit more modern. But instead, it's just modern panels. It's modern art style, modern layouts, modern colors. There's nothing EC about it. What is EC about this? Nothing, you know? And it doesn't help that the stories are set in like modern day. So, I mean, in the EC comics, a lot of the charm and the aura of those stories were in details like dripping wax candles or scurrying rats or scary forests or parlor rooms with massive fireplaces. A modern 2-bedroom apartment just doesn't inspire dread like those old Gothic tales that Al Feldstein came up with. And the fourth section that I am titling The Political Stuff. And really, more than anything, this isn't a critique of including politics. This is a critique of the skill level of the writers of these stories. Look, I'm not going to pretend that politics don't belong in comic books or EC comic books, because I'm not stupid enough to believe that. Politics has always been in comics. Politics has been in every piece of media you've ever ingested. It's just that you don't always realize it, and that's the difference. When Jack Kirby drew Captain America punching Hitler in the face on his debut cover, that was a political stance. Like, America had not entered World War II at that time. Captain America doing that was a political statement. So comics have always had politics, and EC comics have had politics in them. They were just subtle, you didn't realize it. When a wealthy, greedy landlord who overcharged a military veteran for a rat-infested shack and then gets justice by being consumed by those same rats, that's a political statement. That's an actual EC Comics story called A Friend of Our Boys. So it's been in there. It's just that you gotta look for it. You gotta think about it. You don't gotta think about it for these. There's 2 stories in here which I'm calling political stories, even though one of them is just about a topic that was politicized recently. I'll go into it when I get into the review. But of the 4 stories in here, 2 of them I think lean into politics, and they are so ham-fisted, they are so surface level, that even though I am of the same political leanings as these writers, I found it irritating. Like, I found it just like roll my eyes, groan, like, oh my god, give it a rest. Like, it's it's not contributing anything to the conversation. You're not being clever. You're not coming up with anything new. Like, nothing that you have said or written here has turned anyone's mind upside down, changed anyone's mind. All you're going to do is upset people and get stupid people to call your comic book woke, which is the stupidest criticism you can levy at anything, but it's like the go-to now for any time something is vaguely anti-Republican. So like that's all you get. And if you're gonna be political in your writing, you need to be better at it. You cannot just be handing it just like, here it is. Duh. Like, it just doesn't work. And the EC Comics writers, Al Feldstein, Bill Gaines, would read this and they would roll their eyes and they would say, where is the subtlety? Where is the nuance? So, okay, that's why Epitaphs from the Abyss fails as an EC Comics revival. Now, let's just look at this as a horror anthology. The individual stories, are they any good? All right, so there's 4 stories, like I said. The first story is called Killer Speck, written by Jay Holtham and artist Jorge Fornes. I like Jorge Fornes. I really liked, surprisingly, I liked the Rorschach comic that he did with Tom King. But this is a very simple story. A struggling writer who's really full of himself gets upset that his roommate just wrote a script for fun, and it's much better than anything he's ever written. I'm going to be spoiling all of this, by the way. So I'm spoiling every story, so spoilers. And so when he reads the script, he gets incensed, filled with rage, kills the roommate, and then of course, in classic style, roommate comes back to life, kills him, and sends his severed head to his publisher in a box. It is sort of an ironic ending. It's not perfect. I think it's approaching what maybe EC Comics would have done. It follows the style closely enough where you introduce a character who's not very likable, and then you have them cross that line and get justice. That, close enough. It's not exactly, brilliant, and the ending isn't a perfect ironic ending. It just kind of is violent, and it sets a mood, which I'll give it credit for. Definitely not the worst story in here. That one is going to be last. Next story is called Senator, written by Chris Condon, art by Peter Krause. This one, this is the first political one. It is about a journalist who goes to investigate why a certain conservative politician has suddenly flip-flopped on like civil rights issues. There's a lot of like talk about abortion and conservative versus liberal. Again, it's stuff that it's there, it's in your face, it's not subtle. She goes to investigate, she goes to talk to the woman, follows her, and finds that she's been basically operated on by this shadow organization who literally digs into people's brains and makes sure that they pluck out dissenting ideas to make sure that conservatives remain conservative. It's an okay story, but again, it's so on the nose. There's nothing particularly like new about it or subtle about it. So I just like, even though like ignoring it as not being a good EC story, I don't think it's a particularly strong story in general, just because of how ham-fisted it is. The third story is easily the best one in the comic. Easily. This is written by Stephanie Phillips, art by Phil Hester. Phil Hester's art, I think, is the best suited to the subject matter and the material of anything else in here. So this story is about a family that's been forced into their basement by a bunch of people with guns. The dad is given a choice to either kill himself in the next like 5 minutes or kill one member of his family. And if he doesn't make a decision in that time, these people will just kill all of them. And this is an interesting story. It like the family dynamic is explored, quickly but efficiently. The son is saying, just kill me, you could have a better son. So we get an idea like, okay, this son probably like emo, doesn't get along with the father, especially after the father whacks him with a gun. But like the dynamics of the family are explored in relatively short amount of time, and the ending is a perfect EC ending. The father makes his choice. I don't know that do we see who he even chooses? So we don't really see exactly who he chooses, but it cuts to somebody who's watching the events on a laptop, and in the narration, we find out that this is like this dark web online thing where people place bets on who the person's going to kill. So it's kind of like Red Room, like Ed Piskor's Red Room, kind of takes some ideas from that. And so it cuts to the guy who won a bet, like, oh, he chose correctly, they're going to make a lot of money. But then the final panel is the people with the guns closing in on that guy's house. Good ironic ending where everything ties together. The ending is directly related to the events of the story. That's a pretty good EC story. If this story and that first story were really like it for this issue, and maybe we got one other one that was kind of like that, I would say this is a decent horror anthology. But that second story really stinks, and this last story, I hate this last story. And this last story is written by Brian Azzarello, who I've read some stuff from him before. He's pretty good. And art by Vlad Legostave. It's called Us versus Us. It opens with a blonde couple running away from a burning house, and they're screaming, and they're getting chased by these horribly mutated people who have axes and chainsaws. And the reveal is that the blonde couple burned down the house full of mutants because they're vaxxers. That's the reveal. They're vaxxers. They're vaccinated. And the twist is that there's something going around where if you don't get the vaccination, you just die, but if you take the vaccination, you become mutated. It's so stupid. It's so stupid. And what is it even saying? What are we doing? What is this? Like, are we really talking about this still? We're still harping on this debate, like this argument in 2024. I'm like, oh my God. It just struck me as really simple-minded and just kind of dumb. And it didn't feel like it belonged in here at all. It had the completely wrong mood. It wasn't the right kind of like campy or cheesy. Those two stories really just like killed this for me, just on an enjoyment level, just as like trying to enjoy it as a horror anthology. Those stories ruined this book for me. And again, like I said, for an EC Comics revival, it completely fails, in my opinion. It doesn't read like a EC comic at all. And the failure of this is pretty stark in comparison to another horror anthology that came out the exact same day. This is the first issue of Hello Darkness by Boom Studios. And I think it's being like spearheaded by James Tynion IV. And this is great. This was really good. And there's a story in here. I forget the name of it, but it's a story. It's a story about bowling, or about a man who's bowling that goes mad in the bowling alley and starts killing people. And that story was a perfect EC story. It is absolutely perfect, and it's got some political ideas in it. Some of the rantings and ravings he's saying while he's killing people. Yeah, like it's not exactly subtle, not perfect writing, but you can see it, but it doesn't overwhelm the actual action of the story. It blends in really well. The message is interesting, and most importantly, it wraps up perfectly in a perfect gory EC Comics way. So this just overshining the actual EC comic that came out on the same day. I feel like it's a really bad look. And it's crazy because Epitaphs from the Abyss has already gotten an extension. This was supposed to be, I think, a 5 or 6 issue series. They just announced at San Diego Comic-Con that they're extending it to a full year. It's going monthly. So, like, people ordered it. People wanted this comic. I am curious if other people have the same reaction to it as I do. Like, if they're actual EC horror fans, or if they just want a horror book. Like, maybe they're just not going to be as hard on it as I am. But me personally, I'll give this one more issue if I see more. If I've already given up hope on it being an EC comic, but if the stories themselves don't improve in quality, I'm going to drop it after the second issue. So that's where I stand on Epitaphs from the Abyss. Let me know your thoughts on it in the comments below. Thank you very much for spending some time with me today, but now it's time to get back to reading.